Okay. How's that looking? Good?
Looks good.
All right. Sweet. So, yeah, the title of what we're talking about tonight is The Road to a New Prison is Paved with Good Intentions. And what we're going to start off with are a few quotes from different moments in Vermont history. So, first, yeah, as you can see here, it says a system not only of imprisonment, but of hardship, cruelty, and neglect. And in most instances, a released convict went back into society hardened, sour, and quite determined to get square with society for the harsh treatment he had received. That was from the Board of Charities and Probation in 1922. I see institutions as damaging to anyone. The only reason for institutions is for people who won't fit in anywhere else. Institutions imply a lot of things about people that, unless they're true, can cause a sad situation. Here, we're not going to confine people for confinement's sake. We're going to have a place here where people can grow. That was from Hugh Wallace, who is the superintendent of the Youth Center in St. Albans, which opened in 1969, which now is Northwest State Correctional Facility. The traditional closed institution has a consistent record of failure over the last 200 years. With increasing caseloads and steadily rising costs, Vermont cannot afford programs that are proven failures and will only become more wasteful of money and human potential. And that's from Kent Stoneman, who was the DOC commissioner, in a 1972 memo titled A Comprehensive Proposal for Corrections in Vermont. And then finally, there's always a less valued population on whom to inflict punishment. As long as the community divests itself of responsibility for controlling crime by giving up control to the state, citizens will always be disappointed in the response. And that's John Perry, who was the DOC Director of Planning in 1999. And so I want to kind of lay the groundwork for tonight with a few main points that we're going to try to get across. So these quotes might be striking, but part of that is intentional. We want to make it clear that it's nothing new to hear people in power recognize that prisons are failures and propose reforms to make them more rehabilitative or humane. Instead, that's actually how we got to the present moment. And so that might raise the question, how did we get here? And what we're putting forward is that we got here because incarceration is not an objective expression of crime and punishment, right? It has less to do with, criminal or legal policy than the fact that it's a tool of the state to resolve surpluses and discipline labor in the service of capitalism, white supremacy, and colonialism. And then finally, as we'll see in a variety of different contexts, prisons and other incarcerative institutions are inherently and consistently dehumanizing, abusive, and violent. And so for some of you, maybe these are propositions that you're already on board with, and I hope tonight gives you kind of a new application of them to the Vermont context. For others of you, if these aren't necessarily statements that you agree with, yeah, I hope over the next few minutes, we dig into them, and I hope we come at them with curiosity to see how they show up against the record of Vermont history. And so to do that, we're going to kind of go deep and go pretty far back to start. And one thing that I want to be clear about, again, is this idea of prisons having less to do with what goes on necessarily inside the prison and like corrections policy than what the prison is doing in the rest of society. And so we have this quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore: when we focus too much on the prison itself, we lose sight of what the prison does. And so our exploration tonight is going to definitely deal with prisons, but also deal with some other aspects of Vermont society and Vermont history. And so before we get into that, just a little bit of grounding. So what does that mean, when we talk about surpluses? So essentially, the way capitalism operates is that as some places and people get richer, they do so at the same time as, and often because, other people and other places are becoming poorer. And so as things develop unevenly, some places become very rich, some places become very poor, some places have a lot of people, some places have few people. There are surpluses. And these can be surpluses of capital, of land, of labor, all sorts of different kinds of surpluses. And they can be resolved in many ways. People move, land is redeveloped, the government spends money on different programs. And one tool that is used to resolve surpluses is incarceration. And so incarceration can be used to discipline labor, absorb surpluses of people, land, and political capacity, which could have been used to do other things. And it greases the gears of capitalist exploitation and accumulation. And so I would like to invite someone to unmute and read this quote about the state prison in Windsor.
I can read it.
Sweet.
Cool. Okay. The state prison at Windsor has been constructed at the direction of the 1807 legislature in the idealistic hope that an enlightened new approach to punishment, replacing whipping, branding, and physical mutilation with confinement in a house of detention, could lead to reform of inmates' character. After its opening, however, the new facility struggled with inadequate sanitation, heating, and lighting, the consequence of underfunding and poor supervision by a neglectful and parsimonious legislature. It rapidly became overcrowded, and its superintendent instituted a regime of harsh physical punishments to enforce discipline that observers concluded broke rather than mended the spirits of inmates.
Thanks, Meg. And yeah, maybe just for a little continuity here, if you want to read quotes in the future too, just to keep us moving, rather than waiting for someone to unmute. Sweet, thank you. Because yeah, I want to break it up so y'all aren't just hearing my voice the whole time. But yeah, this quote here kind of speaks to, again, this dynamic of institutions maybe starting out with a certain sort of reformist intent, but then quickly moving in a direction that was not intended. And we also have this line from Angela Davis: if the words prison reform so easily slip from our lips, it is because prison and reform have been inextricably linked since the beginning of the use of imprisonments as the main means of punishing those who violate social norms. And so, yeah, this is important to kind of ground us in the fact that prison itself was a reform from other types of punishment. And it's not a form of dealing with harm or dealing with transgressions that has been around forever. It was a very particular thing that arose in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and it hasn't been around forever, and it won't be around forever. And so we're trying to work on what comes next. But it's also important to recognize that prisons at that time still held relatively few people. And many of the people who we would now understand to be disabled, unemployed, or shelterless, or many of the people who end up in Vermont prisons at this time would have ended up on poor farms. And so Vermont, early on in its development, was really defined by kind of wild land speculation, that these claims were backed up by violence, and some people became very rich through that. A lot of people made somewhat of a living, and a lot of people became very poor. For as much as there were booms, there were busts. And so these people who were dispossessed initially would be part of a system of loaning out, where annually there would be auctions in different towns to essentially loan people into indentured servitude. But then after the War of 1812, as American manufacturing and agriculture was suffering from the removal of tariffs on British products, a a lot of people lost their jobs, they lost their farms, and there were so many people who couldn't support themselves that Vermont started to have poor farms. And so, yeah, a few kind of attributes of these sorts of setups. People living there were called inmates. Discipline was enforced through physical punishment. Work was mandated, and people who couldn't work suffered even greater punishment. The population fluctuated as people lost jobs, as people, regained the ability to make ends meet. They would move off of the poor farms. But again, it's this process of like resolving the surplus of folks who are left out of capitalist development. And then increasingly, as the 1800s wore on, asylums were used as a place of housing these people who, again, were kind of surplus to the needs of capitalism or often disabled by capitalism and disabled by colonialism. And so, Meg, if you could, unmute and read this quote about the Brattleboro Asylum.
In 1836 had advertised the asylum as a cheerful country residence where he welcomed patients into his immediate family and where his kind, assiduous, and skillful treatment promised to bring about a restoration of reason. A few decades later, however, Joseph Draper, Rockwell's successor as superintendent, dismissed the family idea as long outgrown and agreed with the trustees that the institution had become a place of growing embarrassments. During those intervening years, the hospital had moved from routinely curing the insane to merely incarcerating them.
Thank you. Yeah, and so as time went along, the state had been investing more and more in the Brattleboro retreat, and became sort of concerned by the reports that they were hearing about those sorts of conditions. And so in the late 1870s, they sent a few commissioners to do a study, and I'm not going to have you read this one because it's quite long, but I hope folks are looking through it as I'm speaking, because I think there are really amazing similarities between the way that these commissioners were writing about the Brattleboro Retreat in 1878 and the way that we talk about prisons today. So saying that, there are many problems with the actual physical infrastructure, and they were overcrowded. If they weren't so crowded, then we wouldn't have to use like the most punishing forms of restraint, while also praising the folks who worked there and saying, yeah, it's a hard situation, but the staff are doing their best. And ultimately, what we need is to invest more and to build another such institution. And that if we increase our investment and we create another similar institution, then we will actually be able to realize the promise of this sort of project. And I think, yeah, that has great implications for us because these sorts of asylums are things that we look back on now, 150 years later, with great disdain and great concern. And yeah, I think future generations will look back on prisons in the same way. I know many of us now already do, but I think the thread that ties the two together is important to note. And what that suggestion for a centrally located asylum led to was the Waterbury State Hospital. And the Waterbury State Hospital ended up being a really crucial part of the eugenics project in Vermont. And I want to talk a little bit about eugenics because, again, it's really important for contextualizing these sorts of institutions and contextualizing not just what happened in the institutions, but the work they were doing. So over the course of the 1800s, the railroad really reshaped Vermont, reshaping which geographies were productive, which places, could participate in capitalist development, which places, you could no longer make a profit. You were no longer competitive if your farm was in a certain spot where the railroad didn't pass. And so it really reshaped the geography of Vermont. And it also reshaped Vermont's geography in relation to other places because the railroad moving west, then agriculture in the Midwest, manufacturing in the Midwest, started to outcompete Vermont manufacturing and Vermont agriculture. And so what this led to was outmigration. People moved west, and in the 1880s and 1890s, Vermont actually, basically flatlined. So many people were moving out that, yeah, the folks being born, were just barely replacing that number. And so folks who did stay were having more and more trouble making a living. Many farms that had been more productive were, yeah, now considered to be on subpar agricultural land. And these brought up kind of a crisis of capitalism and of whiteness, because the struggle to make a living in the same way brought concerns about good Vermont stock. And that's where eugenics really comes in. And it targeted racially mixed families, indigenous people, uphill communities, which were seen as the folks, in contrast to downhill, who were kind of standing in the way of a more modern, interconnected, capitalist, industrial Vermont. And really anyone else living outside the norms of whiteness and capitalist modernity. And it's connected to this story also because the incarcerative institutions that we've talked about, the state prison, the Brattleboro Retreat, the state hospital in Waterbury, the Rutland Reformatory for Women, and then the Virgins and Brandon schools, which were incarcerating young people, they were really the heart and soul of the eugenics program, where superintendents served on the eugenics board. They gave records to researchers, and also the increasing populations that were incarcerated in these places gave legitimacy to the idea of rising degeneracy that needed to be addressed. And so it provided both sort of the cause and actual, like, the mechanisms to carry it out. And that includes the mechanisms, for forced sterilizations. The number is not really certain, but most folks estimate somewhere between like 200 and 300 people were, yeah, unconsensually sterilized throughout eugenics in Vermont. And almost all of these operations happened in these institutions. And yeah, just as with sort of the cause of it, the eugenics movement and what it sought to achieve was not just cultural or racial, it was a socioeconomic project. And so it's also quite stirring to reflect on the fact that many of the ways Vermont ended up developing in the 20th century, sort of reorienting towards tourism, remarketing those subpar farms as second homes, creating a statewide police force, statewide land use laws like Act 250. Many of these things were actually listed as part of the Eugenics Survey of Vermont when they put out their sort of proposal for how to shape Vermont in the late 1920s and early 1930s. And so that kind of brings us up to the more modern period of incarceration in Vermont, where we start to see not that they no longer exist, because those sorts of institutions still definitely exist, and people are incarcerated in psychiatric institutions, but where we start to see prisons become, rather than just one of, the preeminent form of incarceration. And that comes as a bit of a surprise, because this is how DOC Director of Planning John Perry reflected on the DOC's intentions in the early 1970s. Meg, if you could read this quote, that would be great.
Underlying the new model was a belief that institutions never could be adequately staffed and equipped to truly rehabilitate. Inadequate intervention made things worse, and so the best intervention was none at all. Keeping the offender out of the institution entirely became the goal. The community correctional approach used the community to provide intervention at the lowest level of restriction and, not incidentally, cost. The approach kept offenders near home, maintaining the relationships of work, family, and friends, and offering them a greater chance of successful reintegration. The centers were also small, allowing a different kind of culture and management on a more human scale.
Thanks, Meg. Yeah, and so I think, it presents a really interesting question of, if this was the position of the Vermont Department of Corrections in the late 60s, early 70s, how did we end up with the prison system that we have today? Yeah, and M putting in the chat just goes to show that alternatives are possible. Totally, right on. And yeah, I think in trying to answer that question, it's important again to take a step back from the prison itself and to ask, like, in what context was this occurring? And so Vermont was going through really sweeping changes. You know, in the middle part of the 20th century, just as the railroad had reshaped Vermont in the 19th century, the highway was reshaping Vermont in the 20th. And so, again, sort of redefining which areas were productive, which areas had access to shipping to be able to be competitive in other markets. And also, in a huge way, with the development of the automobile, um, opening up new areas of Vermont and opening up Vermont just to a greater extent to tourism. And so factories were leaving, farms were closing, you know, as in many other parts of the country at this point. But the tourism and service industries were really booming, but again, unevenly. So some parts of the state were gaining lots of people and lots of income. Other parts of the state were really left behind. And also in terms of demographics, this is the first point after the population kind of stabilized in the early part of the 20th century. This is the first point where it really starts to increase. So more people were moving into Vermont than moving out. And also the baby boomer generation was entering adulthood. And so there are more and more folks, living in the state than had been living there before at this time, when there are also fewer and also different opportunities to be able to make a living. And in the 1960s, Vermont had kind of unprecedented investment in social programs. Under Governor Phil Hoff, they really expanded lots of programs in terms of like general assistance, welfare, but also education spending, healthcare spending, that sort of thing. But this was rolled back in the early 1970s, which was in part due to fiscal crisis and the oil crisis, but also due to kind of a changing social contract, you know, which again was happening not just nationally, but internationally around like neoliberalism and sort of the reshaping of the role of the state and of the individual, and shifting from this sense of everyone deserves to have their needs provided for and a share of the profits to something very different, much more privatized, much more about individual opportunity rather than equitable outcomes. And then also, and this is a key point, deinstitutionalization was happening throughout this period, through the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. The last poor farms closed in the 1960s in Vermont, and the asylums, some were closing, some, you know, their populations were just drastically reduced. And so you have this kind of stew brewing of, you know, more and more people being made surplus by these different changes, and then also different previous forms of resolving surplus no longer being there, both life-taking forms, you know, like institutionalization and poor farms and asylums, but also more supportive kind of life-making forms of resolving crisis, like the social spending that actually, you know, was providing for people's needs. And so that is the context in which community corrections happens. And that is really relevant to our story because CRCF, the women's prison, was opened in 1975 as the pilot location for the community corrections model. And community corrections was really built on these principles, which, Meg, I'd love for you to read.
I'm here. The policy statement emphasized the following. First, almost all criminal violators do return to the open society. And second, that traditional institutional prisons not only fail to reform or rehabilitate, but operate to increase the risk of continued criminal acts following release. Under this policy, the legislature called for a comprehensive program which, while providing necessary closed custodial confinement for hardened and habitual offenders, will implement as its primary objective the disciplined preparation of violators for their responsible roles in the community.
Thank you, Meg. And so I bolded this part, while providing necessary closed custodial confinement for hardened and habitual offenders, because I think it underscores a really important point about the DOC's platform here, which is that with community corrections, while they were proposing something very, very different in a lot of ways, they also weren't challenging the underlying logic of incarceration. They were saying maybe not as many people need it as we thought. And so we should do this other thing that will be more effective for more people. But we still believe in it. We still need this for, yeah, as they phrase, hardened and habitual offenders. But what that left the door open for was, as with the context just provided around surplus population and yeah, the ways that previous efforts to resolve surplus were kind of subsiding, that left the door open for surplus population to be resolved through prisons. And so law and order politics were also really rising at this time as a reaction to, Black Power movements, civil rights movements, rioting in different urban areas or rebellions in urban areas. And one form that took was the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which was part of the 1968 Omnibus Crime Control Bill, which funded policing to an extent that had not been seen up until that point, and actually led to a record number of police departments in Vermont. The number peaked at 70 in 1973, and it's since decreased because a lot of small towns have said, yeah, once this grant funding ran out, it actually doesn't make sense for us to have a police department. But the overall level of policing has not. It's just grown since then. And overall statewide investment in policing has just grown since then. And similarly, the prison system grew rather than shrank when the community corrections model was implemented. And so over the course of the 1970s, fewer people were given zero minimums. So over half the people at the beginning of the 1970s were given sentences where it was up to the DOC. They could let them out after one day if they wanted. But by the end of the 70s, only around 13% of people had zero minimums in their sentence. And the percentage of incarceration due to property crimes increased from about a quarter to a half. So again, seeing this isn't an increase in incarcerating people or an increase in the incidence of like violent crime or interpersonal crime. That stayed the same during this period, but we were incarcerating people for property crimes, which are more likely to be crimes of survival. So the incarcerated population doubled and the supervised population tripled over the same period. And CRCF, which had opened with this grand vision of, a smaller population and more community connection, was double bunked in 1977, just 2 years after opening. And here is a DOC memo from the end of the 1970s reflecting on these changes, which Meg, I would love for you to read.
The quality of these programs has seriously suffered as a result of increased population. The regional centers have been pressed beyond their capacity as a result of the hardening of community attitudes and the rising institutional populations. Presently, the concerns are more on day-to-day operations. The regional centers are overcrowded. The staff must deal increasingly with the problems of overcrowding, idleness, boredom, and unacceptable behavior. Population, programs, and facilities must be brought back into balance.
Thank you. And so exploring how the DOC intended to bring the population back into balance brings us to the second reform, which is their objective classification model. And big air quotes around objective. Again, this is John Perry from the DOC, this quote saying that the 1982 classification tool put Vermont corrections in the forefront of objective decision-making across the country, according to fair, equitable, and objective criteria. And when you actually look at this document, what these fair, equitable, and objective criteria, actually were things that emphasized greater incarceration and violence over people who had been targeted by incarceration and by state violence in the past. So some of these, again, this phrasing is taken directly from this form. You were targeted for more incarceration or more surveillance if you had experienced prior psychiatric hospitalization or psychotherapy, if you received special education, if you were not raised by an intact biological family, if you had a parent with a history of being on welfare, criminal behavior, psychiatric hospitalization, serious handicap or chronic illness, or homosexuality. These are all different categories. It breaks it down into 1, 2, 3, 4, with 1 being the least, incarceration or supervision, and 4 being the most. All of these phrases come from categories 3 or 4 on the form. So these are folks who would be targeted to stay in prison for longer, to be more surveilled when they come out, that sort of thing. And so, as you have probably already caught on to, all of these were characteristics that are either already targeted by eugenics, a result of being targeted or labeled by eugenics, or a previous effort to resolve surplus in a more positive way, like being on welfare. But essentially what it boils down to is if you had already been surplus, or family members of yours had been made surplus by racial capitalism or by the state, you are now being further targeted with incarceration in prison. And so the connection there is very clear, and I think it's especially shocking, well, perhaps not shocking, but especially telling that it's especially clear in a reform that they were so proud of that put them at the forefront of corrections in this country, which I think says a lot about what corrections and what incarceration does and the purpose of it. And so also tying those connections to the present day, we no longer use the same classification system, but the groups that were targeted are still disproportionately harmed and incarcerated. And so there was a UVM study from 2014 that showed that nearly 40% of incarcerated Vermonters had at least one parent incarcerated during their youth. And that's a pretty disturbing stat when you also consider that currently 1 in 17 children have an incarcerated parent in this state. And so that cycle is just continuing. About 15% were homeless during their youth, and another almost quarter were in foster care. And so that's overall who's incarcerated. But then not just incarceration, but punishment within incarceration is also disproportionate along racial lines, and probably along other lines too, but I haven't been able to access that data. But as you can see there, Vermont is almost entirely white, small Black and Hispanic populations. However, our prison population is much more Black and much more Hispanic than the rest of Vermont. And then also our solitary confinement population, the numbers for BIPOC solitary confinement almost doubles that of the proportion of Black people who are part of the overall prison population. And so I think that's especially telling, again, not just who is locked up, but in the belly of the beast, who is most targeted. It continues to be people who are targeted, across racial lines, and with continuities to these previous forms of eugenics and of racial violence. And so what was also happening outside of prisons at that time to kind of overcome this overcrowding? Once they were classifying people, the people who they let out, they then sought to confine in jails without walls. And so Megan, it'd be great if you could read this as well.
Reinforce probation/parole to serve not as second chance slap on the wrist option, but as an alternative that offers sentencing judges credible punishment, deprivation of liberty, sanctions, and penalties to apply to offenders. In summary, the goal is to provide 6 facilities with walls, and in each probation district, a continuum of jails without walls. This will be accomplished by using such restrictions as curfew, house arrest, daily movement schedules, collateral supervision by local law enforcement agencies, employers, and relatives, daily contact with probation officers, daily distribution of antabuse, low probation caseloads for officers working with offenders under intensive supervision, and random yet regular night and weekend surveillance.
Thanks, Meg. So again, this is from a 1983 memo from the Department of Corrections, and it was the sort of thing that they were celebrating as an intention for the department to keep being this like forward-thinking, reformist, progressive department that they believe themselves to be. And again, when we look at it, it might not be as immediately disturbing as the classification tool, but I think it's especially telling when we put it in the context of the previous intentions around community corrections, where just a decade before this, we had seen the intention recognizing that prisons weren't working and the intention to bring community to prisons and to kind of reinstill that connection and that, yeah, that support and that community by strengthening that relationship. And now just a decade later, after a decade of rolling back welfare, instituting law and order policies, harsher punishments for different crimes, now we see the exact opposite. Rather than trying to bring the community to the prison, they're trying to bring the prison to the community. And especially, I think, disturbing is this line about collateral supervision by local law enforcement agencies, employers, and relatives. So their intention here, again, just a decade after the idealism of community corrections, is to turn all of us, family members, into cops and into prison guards, and that's yeah, I think especially disturbing. And despite this, the prison population continued to grow, and that led to the need for more prisons. And in the 1990s, we saw new prisons in Newport, Vermont, and Springfield, Vermont. And what these two places have in common, I'll let you all read these quotes on your own, were that at the time that they were selected for the new prison, they were the towns with the highest unemployment in the state. So in the early 90s, Newport had the highest unemployment in Vermont. And as you can see there in the quote, had struggled to find, trying to lure other manufacturers to replace the jobs that they had lost in the 70s and 80s. And unable to do that, they were suddenly more compliant for having a prison in their town. Because again, prisons had not gained in popularity. No one saw prisons as a more positive thing at this point. But these towns were in a desperate strait. And Springfield as well, later in the decade, yeah, the language is really clear there. That quote is from Howard Dean at a community forum in Springfield, where he was campaigning for folks to vote yes on a referendum to accept the prison. And as you can see there, he says, let's not make a mistake about it. This is about economic development, and this is a good way for the state to help. So again, coming back to that idea of surplus, Springfield had a thriving machine tool industry that itself, if we go back, had actually been started with prison labor in Windsor, and then the industry moved to Springfield in the 1850s. And then from the 1850s until about the 1950s was thriving, and Springfield was one of the wealthiest towns in the state. And then from the 50s through the 80s, they lost jobs very consistently. And in the mid 90s, they were really struggling and had the highest unemployment in Vermont. And so again, we see the state resolving surplus, not just by putting surplus people into prison, but by using the prison to resolve surpluses where, yeah, the folks in Springfield, needed some sort of economic development, and the prison was able to fill that need. And so again, it's not some objective tool of criminality or crime and punishment. This is about broader systems of capitalism and development. And now we're going to fast forward, because with that, we have kind of the physical infrastructure of the current prison system in place to a recent instance of reform in Vermont prisons. And so this is very current. This is actually currently happening still, the Prison Research and Innovation Network, which, as you can see there, in the words of the Urban Institute, who's the grant funder, it's an effort to build evidence and spur innovation to make prisons more humane, safe, and rehabilitative environments. And in the words of DOC Commissioner Nick Demmel, it continues to be an essential tool in creating transparency in our correctional system and guiding evidence-based improvements. And so it had two phases. First, they did surveys of both the staff and incarcerated populations, which you all have probably seen. If not, I guess we can link them in the chat anyway. I can do that after this. But with really, again, ultimately probably not shocking, but very disturbing data about people developing adverse health conditions, both those who are incarcerated and work in prisons. I believe 40% of people who work in prisons at SSCF in Springfield said that they would leave for another job if it paid as well. And so, yeah, all of these different data points to show it wasn't working. But then the second part of it was supposed to be implementing evidence-based reforms from the survey results, especially, as you can see there at the bottom, enlisting the input of people confined in SSCF. And so there was this thing called the Innovation Council, which brought together incarcerated folks in Springfield to try to be a part of these solutions, creating them from the bottom up and making it a slightly more humane, slightly more rehabilitative place. And instead, what happened was that the men involved in the project were deceived, and they were initially delayed and encouraged to focus on kind of small fruit, where they wanted to focus on things like reentry, connecting to the community, peer support around recovery coaching, that sort of thing, healthcare programs. And they were encouraged by the DOC employees in charge of the project to instead focus on storage bins. And they were disappointed by this, but they did it for over a year. And then as it was kind of becoming clearer and clearer to them that this wasn't supposed to be a small thing to build momentum, this was actually just delaying them. And the DOC did not intend to actually realize the early promise of PRIN. They spoke out and they complained to Goodhale, Brad Goodhale, who was in charge of the program, and to other DOC leadership. And then they faced retaliation. Most of the men who complained were moved to NSCF in Newport, where they could not participate in the program because it was only a pilot program in Springfield. SSCF security staff attended meetings to limit free speech and participation and coerce certain sorts of decisions. DOC staff confiscated meeting notes of members and censored communication between members. And the project has been reoriented further to move away from the actual issues raised in the surveys and to focus on things like ice cream socials, which I think we can all agree are positive things, but it's not really what was supposed to come from a multi-million-dollar grant project. And so, Meg, if you could read this quote reflecting on the process.
PRIN did not start with a crisis or catastrophe. Instead, it started with the recognition that things needed to change. It was born out of an acknowledgement that prisons created deadly environments that did not support rehabilitation. It was a golden opportunity with hundreds of thousands of dollars in independent funding and peer and expert outside support to make things even just slightly better. And yet, even with this opportunity served up to them on a platter, Vermont DOC could not take it. They could not run this program supportively, collaboratively, and humanely because that is not in their nature. Instead, they fell back on all they know: coercion, violence, abuse, and control.
Thanks, Meg. And so again, I want to return to this quote from Kent Stoneman, who was the DOC commissioner at that point in the early 70s, where they were envisioning something really different, when they were envisioning what became CRCF, saying that the traditional closed institution has a consistent record of failure over the last 200 years. And I think it's really important to hold that in mind as we look forward to the struggle that we're all engaged in now. Because I think we are in a very similar moment to the early 1970s. So there's consensus that conventional prisons aren't effective, they don't prevent harm, they're not cost effective, and older prisons in the Vermont system need to be closed. In the 70s, this was the Windsor State Prison that had been built all the way back in the early 1800s, was literally crumbling, and everyone agreed it needed to be closed. Not everyone agreed with community corrections, but that was the model that ended up taking shape. And just as now, there's consensus that our prison system is not working, and consensus even among those who maybe think it is working to some degree, that even CRCF, is inadequate and needs to be closed. In terms of what comes next, similarly, there's growing enthusiasm for a new rehabilitative model, just as in the early 70s with community corrections. Now there's curiosity and support for some sort of like supportive reentry, whether that's like a Scandinavian model or often like the Maine model. Folks refer to a reentry facility in Maine. There's similar enthusiasm around something new that could be different. Similarly, there's also the context of racial justice movements, like the Black Power movements in the 1960s, and the Black Lives Matter movements and George Floyd rebellions of 2020, and the subsequent pro-policing law and order backlash. Just last week, the governor's lawyer stating that the justice system has too many carrots and not enough sticks. And with like the Burlington mayoral race and the conversations around policing in Burlington and other communities, there is this movement back to the right and back in the direction of law and order. And similarly, just as in the 1970s, they were rolling back previous investments from the 1960s in the social safety net and providing public goods. Right now, we're rolling back investments that had been made early on in the pandemic, where we showed again that all of this is just a choice, that we actually can provide for people, for their housing, for their food, for their healthcare. And now we are showing that it is just as much a choice not to. And with the motel programs ending and more people becoming homeless and struggling to provide for themselves, yeah, we will see more and more people being vulnerable and being surplus. And so I would ask, will we make the same mistake? And I think we can ask that question again in the context of that phrase around when we look too close at the prison, we maybe lose sight of what the prison does. I hope it's clear, both looking directly at the prison, we can see that PRIN was a golden opportunity for reform. And if the Vermont DOC could not use PRIN to actually create some positive change, how can we trust them to institute this new, more humane model? But also, when we take a step back beyond just the prison and we look at it in this broader context, it feels like we are on the edge again of increasing policing, increasing law and order, less provision for public goods and for people's well-being, essentially more folks being made vulnerable, being made surplus. And I think that is really important context to bring into our struggle again of, are we going to create infrastructure that, even if it might have more positive intentions, can be used to house and to incarcerate those folks who are made surplus? Or are we going to get to the root of it? And are we going to prioritize the things that actually make people safe, that provide for their well-being, that can address harm, in more positive ways, and allow us to, break these cycles and to do something really, really different, and that's really, really needed. So that is the end of our presentation. Thank you for sitting through that. It means a lot to have everyone here. And yeah, I would open it up for questions, or also if we want maybe to take a break and then come back and do questions and have more of like an open discussion. What do people think? A little break or just get right into it? Okay, I'm seeing in the chat a break would be great. So yeah, it's 7:54. Maybe let's take 5. Let's come back at 8. And yeah, talk a little bit about kind of what this means, because I guess, one thing that I maybe meant to say to kind of close it out is, again, kind of taking a page out of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's book. The only reason to me why any of this research and like kind of sharing it matters is to help us understand the struggle that we're engaged in and where and how we want to fight. And so, I really hope when we come back, if we can, dig into that of what this means for where and how we're fighting. So I'm not going to take any more of your time now. See you in 8.
Jana, do you want to stop the recording?
Yeah, I was just about to do that.
Cool. Perfect.